Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be doing some card analysis, but instead of looking at current cards, I want to go back and take a look at the cards of yesteryear, see what Bushiroad's B team was cooking up in the past, and how it failed spectacularly. So join me as we take a look at Vanguard's Barely Supported. So in today's episode, we're going to look back at an archetype that I guess we can call pack filler support. For those of you who may have started with Overdress, Vanguard packs used to be comprised of 6 to 8 clans of support in each pack. As a result, some clans would need extra cards in order to reach a minimum for each clan. A lot of the time, this would mean that a random archetype from the past would get a wave of support alongside the mainline support for the clan. Today, we're going to be looking at one of my personal favorites, Arboros. Arboros started off as a ride chain in BT8 Bluestorm Armada before receiving their first official support in GBT8 Absolute Judgment. The deck would also see a V-Series counterparts during the Shinemon arc in VB-EB10, The Mysterious Fortune. So with that out of the way, let's get into the cards themselves. We'll start off with the grade 0 of the ride line, Arboros Dragon Ratoon, a grade 0 with 4k power and 10k shield. When it's written over by Arboros Dragon Branch, you get to check the top 7 cards of the deck and add either the grade 2 or 3 of the ride line. If it gets written over by anything other than Branch, you can call it to rear. So this is what tends to be referred to as the 3rd generation of ride chains. As opposed to the 2nd generation, which would fetch out the grade 2 of the ride line, these are reduced to a top 7 search, but allow you to pick which step you need in the current situation. These days, the effect is a bit subpar, but it's still usable. The fact that these cards have gotten V retrains makes this card better, as the original cards have been since power cracked. Next up, we have the grade 1 Arboros Dragon Branch, a grade 1 with 7k power and 5k shield. On Vanguard, it gets 1k, while Ratoon is in the soul, and when it's ridden over by Timber, the grade 2, you can call a unit with the same name as one of your rearguards from the deck. Here's where we see the main gimmick of Arboros, cloning rearguards. While Neo Nectar has always been about superior calling units from the deck, Arboros was the first instance of duplicating rearguards. Getting onto the skills themselves, being an 8k base Vanguard used to be quite a bit more back in the day, but these days it's completely irrelevant. The dupe skill is nice, but it does require you to set it up. You can realistically only clone a grade 0 or grade 1 since you'll need to call in the previous turn since the skill activates on ride. In a modern lens, there's no real reason to play more than one of this card outside of the Vanguard skills. It's effectively a 7k vanilla, and even then, you're relying on hitting a specific card for a setup +1. Continuing with the grade 2 Arboros Dragon Timber is a grade 2 with 9k power and 5k shield. On Vanguard, it gets another 1k power with Branch in the Soul, and when it's ridden over by Sephiroth, you get to clone one of your rearguards. So just like with Branch, this skill isn't worth trying to set up. The extra 1k is meaningless as well, since Neo Nectar is a Force clan, and most all your grade 2s are 10k base anyway. The same setup conditions still apply, although you do have the ability to clone grade 2 rearguards now. Getting into the main man himself, we have Arboros Dragon Sephiroth, a grade 3 with 10k power. Just like the previous ride chain cards, he gets 1k while Timber is in the soul. This makes it so that your Vanguard is 11k base, which is typical for the time. However, it has a downstream effect of making your extra copies into 10k vanillas. Sephiroth's main skill is his Limit Break 4, which gives a skill to all your Neo Nectar rearguards that they gain 3k power while there is another unit with the same name as them. Now do note that this isn't a 3k for each rearguard, but a static 3k power buff. If you wanted to maximize the power gain, you would need 3 back row rears with the same name and 2 front row rears also having the same name. However, unless the front row rears are 2 more copies of Sephiroth, the Vanguard won't be getting any power. These days, there are a lot of ways to copy names, and plant tokens technically all have the same name, but that being said, there really isn't any reason to play this card anymore. For the longest time, that was all there was to the Arboros archetype. Outside of needing to play with all the ride chain cards, the deck could splash in any Neo Nectar support to keep the deck playable. With the advent of the G era, Arboros' gimmick would be co-opted by Asha, the new flagship of Neo Nectar, who would expand the strategy and even give it a name, Bloom. Unfortunately, the best of the support would be locked to Asha herself, meaning that Arboros was left in the wastebasket of history. Until GBT8, that is, when we would see a sudden wave of support along Asha's last wave of support for the first G-era arc. Let's take a look at how Bushiroad decided to rejuvenate Arboros. We'll start off with Screen of Arboros, Ayla, a grade 1 with 7k power and 5k shield. She has a single skill that on Vanguard, you can put a Ratoon from your rearguard into the soul to search out either Branch or Timber. If you searched out Branch, you can ride it as stand. So this skill is kind of reminiscent of another right chain fixer, Odysseus. But unlike that card, this one is absolutely terrible. Unlike Odysseus, Alina is restricted to only putting Rantoon in the soul in order to search. It is nice that this card is effectively 4 more copies of Branch, since if you ride it, Rantoon pops out of the soul, and you can use Isla to fix your ride line. However, this gets to the other main problem of this card. It only works on Vanguard. Unless you want to play multiple Rantoons in the main deck, you won't be able to use the skill more than once, but realistically, why would you want to? It's a 1-for-1 trade that really only accomplishes soul generation. If Isla could put any card, like Odysseus, I could see it being used as kind of a tutor, but in this state, it's not really worth looking at. Next up, we have a first for this series, Bulwark of Arboros, Salamina, a sentinel with 6k power. Rather than being a PG, this card is actually a quintet wall. Aside from that, it actually does have an additional skill. From the cards it calls to the Guardian Circle, you can actually add one card that shares a name with any of the cards on your Vanguard or Rearguard circles to your hand. Do note that this add happens as part of the guard step, so if you add a card with shield, you are actually taking away from your total shield value. Of course, if you end up calling a copy of your Vanguard, you can simply take it with no problems. The viability of quintet walls in the meta is really debatable. In one sense, they do represent a 1-card guard that most of the time can net you around 30k shield. At the same time, it literally takes 5 cards off your deck and can mill valuable pieces in a format where a deck out is a pretty common problem. Add to that the fact that most decks typically don't want to be wasting CB2 Sentinel, and probably the only saving grace of this card is the Arboros name, meaning that it is technically a searchable Sentinel within the archetype. Getting into the grade 2s, we have Warden of Arboros, Arini, a grade 2 with 9k power and 5k shield. If you have a grade 3 Arboros, you can, once per turn, counterblast 1 to give Arini 2k power and choose one of your rear guards and give it the same name as Ari. So this skill is meant to kind of patch up Arboros. Asha has quite a few cards to do this, but Arboros is reliant on this. The extra 2k was nice back in the day when most Vanguards were 11k base, but these days it falls short. Not to mention that the skill costs CB, making it even more questionable. The other skill lets you, on rearguard, when it hits a Vanguard, to bot deck a card from your drop in order to look at the top 5 cards of your deck and add 1 Arboros to your hand. It's kind of interesting that it didn't restrict the cost to normal units, especially since the skill shuffles the deck. But I guess the designers didn't really worry about it. I guess they were right, since this card really isn't very good. If the skill were on hit of anything, this skill would actually be pretty nuts. Recycling triggers and deck thinning at the same time? Sign me up! However, the Vanguard restriction really ruins the potential of this card, and the update to base power levels makes it almost impossible to trigger. Finishing up the main deck Arboros cards, we have Arboros Compost Dragon, a grade 3 with 11k power. On Van or Rear, if you have an Arboros Vanguard, you can counterblast 2 when it hits to draw 1 card for each of your units with the same name as this unit. Neonectar does have a few cards to duplicate names, so it's technically feasible to draw 5 cards off of its skill. However, the amount of setup you'll need to do is probably not worth the effort, especially since the skill is on hit, meaning you don't have control over when you use it. In my opinion, the amount of deck space it would take to facilitate the maximization of this card is really not worth it. If you're going to be using a CB2 to draw, I would think that you would want to at least draw 2 cards, and reaching that point with the limited commitment isn't really going to happen. I would skip this one. Finishing off the G support, we have the G unit Arboros Dragon Ein Sof Ur, a grade 4 with 5k plus power and the following skill. If you have an Arboros Heart, you can Soul Blast 1 in order to give it 2 skills. The first skill that it gets is on attack, you can choose one of your guards and call a copy of it from the deck. Right off the bat, this is actually pretty decent. It's multi-attack and can theoretically combo off depending on what unit you call. There's not much else to say, good skill for once. The second skill you get is that on GB2, all your front row Arboroses get an extra 5k. This power buff is nice, but it does kinda suck that it's locked behind a GB2 on a unit that doesn't flip. Furthermore, if you want to extend off the superior call, you probably aren't using Arboros cards, meaning you lose out on this extra power. It's not the end of the skill, but it's worth noting. So that's really it for the G support. One grade 1, 2, and 3, a Sentinel, and a G unit. This is pretty typical for G-era support of old archetypes. There was clearly an attempt to stick to the original game plan of Arboros, but the way they accomplished it was really clunky and didn't stand the test of time. It's possible the designers didn't want to step on Asha's toes and only needed an extra 5 Neonectar cards for the set, so we ended up with this half-baked wave of support. For the longest time, this is where Arboros would stay. You could always update the deck with new Neo-Nectar support, but the lack of any new Arboros cards meant that the deck would always be playing second fiddle to whatever the new Neo-Nectar game plan was. However, this would all change in 2019 when we would see the introduction of the Arboros dragons into the V series. Played by Nanami in the Shinemon arc, we would see the retrain of all 4 cards from the original ride chain, along with 1 new support card. This time, Arboros Dragon would assimilate into the current strategy of Neo-Nectar, that being plant tokens. We start off with the V Arboros Dragon Rentoon, a grade 0 with 6k power and 10k shield. It has the generic V-Star effect to draw a card when it's ridden over, and to get a quick shield if your opponent is on grade 1 or higher. There is a small reason you would play this over any other V starter, which we'll get into later. Moving on, we have the V Arboros Dragon Branch, a grade 1, this time with 8k power and 10k shield. When it attacks or boosts an attack that hits, you can check top 4 cards and add 1 Arboros to your hand. The remaining cards go to the bottom of the deck. Wow, an actually pretty decent card, who'd have thought? But in all honesty, we have to look at the context of when this was released in. The Mysterious Fortune is fairly late into V, so the design team has probably already figured out what they want the format to be, and the quality of cards is much better. But actually getting into the card itself, it's a versatile card that can work at any stage of the game. Unlike previous support, Branch doesn't need to hit a Vanguard. Now the quality of cards you're searching out really isn't the greatest, but it's always better to have searching at on-hit pressure than not. Who can say no to a +1? Continuing the ride chain, we have V Arboros Dragon Timber, a grade 2 this time with 10k power and 5k shield. When it's placed on Van, the next plant token you call is called as a 10k token with 10k shield and intercept along with boost. So here we have the new Arboros gimmick for the V series, calling improved plant tokens. With the shift of Neo-Nectar's game plan, Arboros adapted and actually brought something new to the table. The skill technically does require you to use another card to call the plant token, but Neo-Nectar has no shortage of token generators. In fact, other copies of this card are token generators, since when Timber is placed on rearguard, you can call a plant token. The versatility of this card is typical of V-Series design. Timber is simple in what he does, but he's still a very good card. Finally reaching the top of the line, we have V Arboros Dragon Sephiroth, a grade 3 with 13k power and the imaginary gift Force. On Vanguard, all plant tokens get called as superior tokens. Once again, this is a simple skill that has intricate interactions. You have the ability to swarm the field with powerful tokens that can give you an extremely powerful early game. Unfortunately, this card in Premium is not as great since striding over this will turn off this skill. Technically, you can use it if you stride Sandrine, but it's a bit awkward. In any case, let's move on to the second skill. On Van or Rear, you can once per turn retire a rearguard to call 2 plant tokens. Then, if you have a full board, this unit gets 10k. So once again, we have another great skill. The retire isn't restricted to just tokens, so you can retire used rearguards and get a +1. This skill makes any spare copies of Sephiroth into good beaters. It has its positives and negatives though. First of all, you might not want to call your extra copies since it's pretty good to re-ride each turn to get an extra gift. Secondly, the skill is an act, meaning you can't proc it during the battle phase to increase your multi-attack. Despite that, this card is overall pretty good. The final Arboros card is Gale of Arboros Oliver, a grade 2 with 10k power and 5k shield. It has a single skill that if you have 2 or more Arboros in the soul, you can counterblast 1 and resolve one of the following effects. Either you call 2 plant tokens, or you can retire 2 rearguards and give this unit 20k and an extra critical. So this card really is a mixed bag. The skills you get for CB1 isn't terrible. I would say calling 2 tokens is fine, and the second skill is a lot more interesting. It turns this card into a 30k beater with a crit, which is nothing to sneeze at. Add to that any force markers, and it turns this unit into a huge threat. This card is really good on paper, but it has a few things holding it back. The first is that this is an axe skill. If this were an on place, you could call Oliver during the battle phase and either multi-attack or get crit pressure. However, as is, the card falls a little short. Secondly, Neo-Nectar really isn't well equipped to utilize high pressure rearguards. Ideally, this is a rearguard you would want to stand multiple times, but Neo-Nectar multi-attacks by calling new rears. Unless you play stand triggers, which mind you, Neo-Nectar does have a few decent ones, you're looking at a single high pressure swing. Arboros is an interesting archetype. He served as a prototype for what Neo-Nectar would eventually become, and really got pushed to the wayside. This is pretty typical for most of the ride chains introduced in Vanguard's early days. Some ride chains got more support than others, but at this point, almost all of them have gotten V retrains. Unfortunately, Arboros was not one of the lucky few to receive good support during the G era, and thus has had to rely on good generic support. It may be worth noting that Arboros' playstyle was inherited by a new ride line introduced in V-Clan Collection Volume 6. Had these cards just been Legacy Arboros support, the deck might be in a better place. But alas, we're left with a deck that is doomed to be a just for fun deck. Here's a deck list you can try out. It's a more defensive build focused around calling additional plant tokens with Rain Breath Dragon during the opponent's turn to create more 10k shield. It also utilizes the grade 3 Ganjiro for extra defense. There's also the Olivier and Lotsevere combo to get multiple Olivier swings. But that's going to be it from me. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode, and don't forget to do all those YouTube things, and I'll see you guys in the next one.